And President Trump continues to be eager to reopen the economy, saying yesterday that plans are close to being finalized. Even as health experts warn, he is likely moving too fast. As Joe mentioned yesterday, we showed you his 30-day evolution from "it's all up to the states" to "I have total authority."
I don't take responsibility at all. We're letting the governors do in their states pretty much what they want. So you have to look at states. You have to give a little bit of flexibility. We have a thing called the Constitution, which I cherish, number one. And as you know, I want the governors to be running things. The President of the United States has the authority to do what the President has the authority to do, which is very powerful. The President of the United States calls the shots. They can't do anything without the approval of the President of the United States. When somebody's the President of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be. The authority is total.
Good God. Yesterday, he appeared to back away from his total authority over the state's claims, saying he'll give them the authority that they, of course, already have.
The day will be very close because certain states, as you know, are in much different condition and in a much different place than other states. It's going to be very, very close, maybe even before the date of May 1st. So that will be for some states. Actually, there are over 20 that are in extremely good shape. And we think we're going to be able to get them open fairly quickly, and then others will follow. But we're all set. As I said, the governors are going to be opening up their states. They're going to declare when. They're going to know when. Some can open very, very shortly, if not almost immediately. We'll give a date, but the date's going to be in the very near future. So we'll get it open. Individual states, when the governors will be held accountable. If they need things, we'll help them get those things, but we want them to do their testing. We want them because they're equipped to do testing. And for some reason, things are happening that we're not going to like the numbers are heading in a wrong direction. We'll have to do something that's very serious. We'll have to maybe close them up and start all over again.
Well, you know, he talks about testing. The problem is that testing is the failure on the testing front. It keeps getting worse by the day. You look at it per American, per citizen. The testing it's catastrophic. You look again, we go to Donald Trump's home county, Palm Beach County. The testing is just absolutely abysmal there. It's abysmal across middle America. It's abysmal on both coasts. And, you know, it's really interesting.
And he still doesn't use the DPA to nationalize it.
It's really interesting, Reverend Al. You have some of these Trumpist talking heads talking about let's reopen the economy right now. Some editorials talking about, oh, let's open the economy, you know, let's get the economy open as fast as possible. The liberals want to keep it closed. It's the medical providers, medical people want to keep it closed until it's safe to reopen. And you have all of these people that are now, you know, sort of parroting Larry Kudlow's line. People need to get back to work, and if they don't want to get back to work, it's because they don't like working. I don't see these pro-Trump media outlets rushing their people back to work, and they're not going to because they know it's not safe. They don't want their people to die. They don't want to die. And yet they continue to say these reckless, irresponsible things in the press about quickly reopening the government. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, you know, blamed the liberal media for wanting to keep things. Are you kidding me? What? Is the Wall Street Journal editorial staff rushing into work today in their office? No, they're not. And it's just a reckless thing to say. And go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Reverend Al.
None of the Trumpsters or the big supporters of the president that are saying we need to get back to work, they're not rushing back to work. Many of them are at home with masks and gloves on, hiding under the bed while they're trying to tell everybody else to go back to work. And I think that The president, we saw, demonstrated his fragile ego because some of the governors stepped forward and started doing what they're supposed to do, governing. He couldn't stand for anyone else to take center stage, so he rushes out there, and part of it was his ego. The other part was a distraction, something you've been saying on this show almost every morning, that the strategy he has is to ignore people dying and ignore how they have not governed this right, and let's pick fights over here so you're distracted. And I think Andrew Cuomo, our governor in New York, was brilliant to say, I'm not going to give you a fight. I'm not going to give you a distraction. When I was a youngster, I was very much a fan of Muhammad Ali, who I did get to know, and he had a strategy called rope-a-dope, and that's what Andrew Cuomo did to President Trump. He just leaned back and said, you punch yourself out. I'm not going to exert any energy. I'm going to let you punch yourself out, and that's what we're seeing, a rope-a-dope at the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Governor Cuomo showed his frustration to us in his interview yesterday, and then during his own briefing after our interview, said, you know what, I'm not fighting. I have too much work to do in the state of New York. Let's go to the White House. NBC News correspondent Hans Nichols is standing by there for us. Hans, good morning. So May 1st, the president said that he wants to reopen some parts of the economy, whatever that means exactly. What will that look like? Is there a strategy there, or is that just a signal to some people who've been putting pressure on him to reopen pieces of the economy?
Oh, there's always signaling with President Trump, Willie. I think that's pretty clear, not just yesterday, but throughout the entire crisis. He's tried to send different messages to different people. What I heard yesterday was reopening, at least for parts of the country, in April. And I tried to press the president on that, if that means that he's really stopping his slow the spread, which was supposed to go through May 1. He said absolutely not. But when you listen to what he actually is saying, and that is that individual states get to make these decisions in consultation with the federal government, but clearly the president is back to being a federalist. You guys showed those clips, letting the states make this decision. President seems to be suggesting that certain states could be opening in the month of April. And it's not just a handful. He at one point said 20. At another point, he came up to 29. So to me, yesterday's briefing was more about what the president didn't do, and that is he didn't try to escalate his feud or his fights with these governors. Remember that tweet we had mid-morning about mutiny on the bounty? Captain Bligh didn't show up to that presser yesterday. That was a dovish, trying to be friendly president. Now, there's a glaring exception to that, and that is going after the WHO, an international health organization, at the time that there is an international health crisis. The president didn't articulate why he's punishing potentially millions, even billions of people around the world that rely on the WHO for bureaucratic errors at headquarters. He didn't articulate that. And inside the administration, they think that they can maybe funnel some money around and go directly to some of these countries that may need it. That's exceedingly difficult in the middle of a pandemic. Willie mentioned, right, there are clear problems with the WHO. No one will deny that. But cutting off funding was really, I don't want to say the nuclear option, but it was the big option. And the president is going to be reviewing it, but I can't imagine that health centers and clinics all across the globe aren't wondering what this means for them in a time of crisis, and the president's decided to go after them. So we'll see what follow-up there is on that today. Guys?
Hans, let me ask you about China. The president attacked the WHO for being too close to China. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's a tweet that the president tweeted out on January the 24th. Of course, if you've been watching our show, you've seen it several times this morning already. But in this January 24th tweet,
there it is.
The President of the United States said China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will work out well. We're over 20,000 deaths now. In particular, on behalf of the American people, I want to thank President Xi. Can you explain why the President of the United States would write that tweet at the same time that his medical people were complaining bitterly and others in the government were complaining bitterly that the Chinese were not cooperating with us? They were lying about what was going on in their country. They were not helping our scientists prepare for this to come to the United States?
I can't, because it's inconsistent, right? I mean, we could say maybe the president didn't see those memos. There's mixed reporting on that. You know, when he talks about his own response, that January 24th, that timestamp is significant because it comes after the president decided to shut down the big thing that he claims, which is closing down travel from China. Even yesterday, given the opportunity to say, look, you're going after the WHO, their retributions or recriminations are just consequences for the WHO, well, we do something similar on China. And the president fell back to this idea that he's in a trade negotiation with China and that they're going to be buying billions of dollars of agriculture, all kinds of equipment from the United States, as well as goods and services. So throughout this, he's been very dovish and very reluctant to criticize China, with the one exception, and that is when he refers to this, either the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. But Joe, I just, it's inconsistent, right? And so I think at a certain point,
right,
you know, when we're standing here on the White House lawn, if the president says one thing like he did on Monday, that he has total power, and then doesn't say it the next day, which he says yesterday, and just basically says he's going to be cooperative and conciliatory, I think that those inconsistencies tell us that either A, there's tension in the administration, or B, the president's changing his mind day to day based on the information feeds he's coming in. And as of yesterday morning, he was Captain Bligh, right? He wanted to fight. He wanted to all but whip the governors. And by the evening, Easter lamb is too strong, but he was pretty conciliatory and saying he's going to be doing a big conference call and working with the governors. So it's inconsistent, and that's my only answer.
He was very dovey. He's a day trader. NBC's Hans Nichols. I said that, not you. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we go to... Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.